原型卡、活页纸或笔记本、笔。活动方法：阅读完情绪阴影、心灵整合之父荣格带你认识内在原型，享受情绪自由一个章节后，请翻阅你手边该类别的原型56心灵互动卡，以下简称原型卡，尽可能细致地观察卡片中各种人物的细节，并记录下你对该图片印象的看法，以及任何闪过你脑海中的图像、画面、文字对话。将这些画面和文字与你现在的生活做连结，并关注自己内心浮现出来的想法、渴望与行动。2、关系用途，寻找4个我。功能：改善家庭、伴侣、有才、同事关系。场合：一般室内空间。对象：2人。准备工具：1或2副56张原型卡、空白纸、数张、笔。活动方法：可以与你的亲密伴侣、朋友或家人一起使用原型卡，请从一副原型卡中挑选出你觉得对方眼中的你具有哪些原型特质，以及你眼中的自己有哪些原型特质。再请对方从另一副原型卡中挑选出他眼中的你有哪些原型特质。若只有一副卡，请自己挑选完后，将人物注记在表格旁，再将卡给另一人挑选、注记。2、当各自完成卡片的挑选后，挑几张皆可，请与对方讨论看看2人的答案相仿度有多高。当你眼中的自己与对方眼中的你具有很大差异时，切莫惊慌，请尽量平心静气地讨论这份差异从何而来。3、在空白纸上画出如有的黑暗里周哈里窗。表格，请你们再次各自检视实际上对方眼中的你。你以为对方眼中的你眼中的自己，三者之间的差异，并将这些原型人物特质依据表格中的灰色字指示位置记录上去。你可以从中发现你的开放我、盲目我、隐藏我以及未知的自我。检视过你的4个我之后，可以换手进行对方的4个我特质检视。开放我是自己知道，他人知道。你眼中的自己与实际上对方眼中的你的交集。未知我是自己未知与他人未知的交集。你眼中的自己与实际上对方眼中的你相加之后都会提到的原型人物。自己未知是盲目我，他人知道。实际上对方眼中的你减去你眼中的自己。隐藏我是自己知道，他人未知。你眼中的自己减去实际上对方眼中的你，加上你以为对方眼中的你减去实际上对方眼中的你。 学校社团带领，活络团体气氛，活化团体咨商，场合较大的室内空间，对象多人，准备工具56张圆形卡、情境卡。活动方法，请依序线剪下盒中首副情境卡，填好后全部收拢，文字朝下。洗牌后可以进行3人以上的桌上活动，可依照建议的年龄层挑选适合众人的人际情境，分成人题与青春题。也可以自行加入更多的人际情境。2. 将56张圆形卡洗牌，图文面朝下后，猜拳决定庄家，由庄家发牌，每人先发4张圆形卡，之后由庄家先翻开情境卡，并阅读上面的人际情境。庄家及其他玩家必须从自己手中的圆形卡中挑选出一张适合用来解决该情境的圆形人物。各玩家将选中的图形卡摊示在众人面前，然后分别描述自己选择这位圆形人物来解决该人际情境的原因，用光明面或阴影面解读皆可，自由发挥。之后由各玩家依照方才描述的内容进行投票，决定说得最有道理的人为赢家。票数相同时，则猜拳决定优胜者。3. 赢家可收回自己的圆形卡，并在其他玩家桌子的牌卡中挑选1张纳为己有，其余卡片则放入尚未发出的圆形卡最下方。接着顺时钟为序，轮到下一位做庄家。庄家再发给每个人1张圆形卡，于是每个人手中的圆形卡至少恢复至少4张。前的一轮的赢家，此时手上则多余4张牌卡。继续同样的流程，直至圆形卡全部都发完为止。5. 圆形卡发完后，庄家们可以决定游戏结束，中途也可随时停止，由手上最多牌卡的人获胜，或者继续进行，不再补卡，直至某位玩家手上的圆形卡全部用完为止，仍由获得最多圆形卡的玩家获胜。6. 游戏结束后，可将情境卡用夹链袋收好，放回盒内，可多次使用。敌人还是朋友？功能：公司、学校、社团带领，活络团体气氛，活化团体咨商。场合较大的室内空间，对象多人，准备工具56张圆形卡。活动方法： 1. 将56张圆形卡洗牌，图文面朝下后，猜拳决定庄家，由庄家发牌，每人先发的4张牌卡。2. 庄家首先由自己获得的4张牌卡中挑选1张，摊示于其他玩家面前，并描述自己对该圆形人物的看法，然后要求各玩家提供1张圆形人物，作为庄家出示的圆形卡的朋友或敌人。各玩家从自己手上的圆形卡挑选并出示，说明这张圆形人物足以成为庄家的圆形人物朋友或敌人的原因，用光明面或阴影面解读皆可，自由发挥。最后由庄家从玩家中决定谁是优胜者，优胜者可与庄家平分所摊示出来的牌卡，由庄家先行挑选，不能整出的牌卡则放回未发出的圆形卡最下方。3. 接着顺时钟为序，轮到下一位做庄家。庄家再发给每个人1张圆形卡，使每个人手上的牌卡至少恢复4张。前一轮的庄家及赢家，此时手上则多余4张牌卡。继续同样的流程，直至圆形卡全部发完为止。 原型卡发完后，玩家可以决定游戏结束，中途也可随时停止，由手上最多牌卡的人获胜，或者继续进行，不再补卡，直至某位玩家手上的原型卡全部用完为止。能由获得最多原型卡的玩家获胜。这本书呢，其实有一些评论并不是这么好。这句话可能要看一下。荣格对原型的定义是象征性的、抽象的，说明原型是某种心灵的结构，类似文化中的本能一样的层次。我们无法直接观测，却可以由神话、童话、民族意识中概略地去旁敲侧击。这本书几乎没有使用荣格论述原型的方式去书写原型，没有使用神话与童话、民俗等的象征去论述。从这本书的书写方式的不细腻与急于求成，容易导致荣格学说中的原型阴影被误认为一种诊断准则、分类人的方式。这本书是参考 Carrie Myers 的原型卡而衍生出的理论。然而，这位原型卡的作者也并非心理学家，而是身心灵方面的工作者。他对原型的理解是他自己的发想，并非符合荣格的原旨。他的12原型是直接挪用12星座的概念而来。这本书在测验编制、人格分类方面是有贡献的，但是它不符合荣格的原则，讲的东西几乎快与荣格无关了。现代人多半在自我了解方面急于速成，喜欢分类。这本书因此蔚为风潮，但是却大大让大家误解了荣格原意。这个是现在流行的这个牌卡这一类，使用的时候要特别注意的地方。 push the child archetype.
Concerning the archetypes, with special reference to the anima concept 111. Although modern man appears to believe that the non-empirical approach to psychology is a thing of the past, his general attitude remains very much the same as it was before, when psychology was identified with some theory about the psyche. In academic circles, a drastic revolution in methodology, initiated by Fechner II and Wundt III, was needed in order to make clear to the scientific world that psychology was a field of experience and not a philosophical theory. To the increasing materialism of the late 19th century, however, it meant nothing that there had once been an experimental psychology, for to which we owe many descriptions that are still valuable today. I have only to mention Dr. Justinus Colonel Seherin von Prevorst. 5. All romantic descriptions in psychology were anathema to the new developments in scientific method. The exaggerated expectations of this experimental laboratory science were reflected in Fechner's psychophysics, and its results today take the form of psychological tests and a general shifting of the scientific standpoint in favor of phenomenology. 112. Nevertheless, it cannot be maintained that the phenomenological point of view has made much headway. Theory still plays far too great a role, instead of being included in phenomenology as it should. Even Freud, whose empirical attitude is beyond doubt, coupled his theory as a sine qua non with his method, as if psychic phenomena had to be viewed in a certain light in order to mean something. All the same, it was Freud who cleared the ground for the investigation of complex phenomena, at least in the field of neurosis. But the ground he cleared extended only so far as certain basic physiological concepts permitted, so that it looked almost as if psychology were an offshoot of the physiology of the instincts. This limitation of psychology was very welcome to the materialistic outlook of that time, nearly 50 years ago, and, despite our altered view of the world, it still is in large measure today. It gives us not only the advantage of a delimited field of work, but also an excellent excuse not to bother with what goes on in a wider world. 113. Thus it was overlooked by the whole of medical psychology that a psychology of the neuroses, such as Freud's, is left hanging in mid-air if it lacks knowledge of a general phenomenology. It was also overlooked that in the field of the neuroses Pierre Janet, even before Freud, had begun to build up a descriptive methodology 6 without loading it with too many theoretical and philosophical assumptions. Biographical descriptions of psychic phenomena, going beyond the strictly medical field, were represented chiefly by the work of the philosopher Theodore Flournoy, of Geneva, in his account of the psychology of an unusual personality. 7. This was followed by the first attempt at synthesis, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902. I owe it mainly to these two investigators that I learned to understand the nature of psychic disturbances within the setting of the human psyche as a whole. I myself did experimental work for several years, but, through my intensive studies of the neuroses and psychoses, I had to admit that, however desirable quantitative definitions may be, it is impossible to do without qualitatively descriptive methods. Medical psychology has recognized that the salient facts are extraordinarily complex and can be grasped only through descriptions based on case material. But this method presupposes freedom from theoretical prejudice. Every science is descriptive at the point where it can no longer proceed experimentally, without on that account ceasing to be scientific. But an experimental science makes itself impossible when it delimits its field of work in accordance with theoretical concepts. The psyche does not come to an end where some physiological assumption or other stops. In other words, in each individual case that we observe scientifically, we have to consider the manifestations of the psyche in their totality. 114 These reflections are essential when discussing an empirical concept like that of the anima. As against the constantly reiterated prejudice that this is a theoretical invention or, worse still, sheer mythology, I must emphasize that the concept of the anima is a purely empirical concept, whose sole purpose is to give a name to a group of related or analogous psychic phenomena. The concept does no more and means no more than, shall we say, the concept arthropods, which includes all animals with articulated body and limbs and so gives a name to this phenomenological group. The prejudice I have mentioned stems, regrettable though this is, from ignorance. My critics are not acquainted with the phenomena in question, for these lie mostly outside the pale of merely medical knowledge, in a realm of universal human experience. But the psyche, which the medical man has to do with, does not worry about the limitations of his knowledge, it manifests a life of its own and reacts to influences coming from every field of human experience. Its nature shows itself not merely in the personal sphere, or in the instinctual or social, but in phenomena of worldwide distribution. So if we want to understand the psyche, we have to include the whole world. For practical reasons we can, indeed must, delimit our fields of work, but this should be done only with the conscious recognition of limitation. The more complex the phenomena which we have to do with in practical treatment, the wider must be our frame of reference and the greater the corresponding knowledge. 115 Anyone, therefore, who does not know the universal distribution and significance of the syzygy motif in the psychology of primitives, 8 in mythology, in comparative religion, and in the history of literature, can hardly claim to say anything about the concept of the anima. His knowledge of the psychology of the neuroses may give him some idea of it, but it is only a knowledge of its general phenomenology that could open his eyes to the real meaning of what he encounters in individual cases, often in pathologically distorted form. 116 Although common prejudice still believes that the sole essential basis of our knowledge is given exclusively from outside, and that nihil est in intellectu quod non antia fuerit in sensu, it nevertheless remains true that the thoroughly respectable atomic theory of Leucippus and Democritus was not based on any observations of atomic fission but on a mythological conception of smallest particles, which, as the smallest animated parts, the soul atoms, are known even to the still Paleolithic inhabitants of Central Australia. 9 How much soul is projected into the unknown in the world of external appearances is, of course, familiar to anyone acquainted with the natural science and natural philosophy of the ancients. It is, in fact, so much that we are absolutely incapable of saying how the world is constituted in itself. And always shall be, since we are obliged to convert physical events into psychic processes as soon as we want to say anything about knowledge. But who can guarantee that this conversion produces anything like an adequate objective picture of the world? That could only be if the physical event were also a psychic one. But a great distance still seems to separate us from such an assertion. Till then, we must for better or worse content ourselves with the assumption that the psyche supplies those images and forms which alone make knowledge of objects possible. 117 These forms are generally supposed to be transmitted by tradition, so that we speak of atoms today because we have heard, directly or indirectly, of the atomic theory of Democritus. But where did Democritus, or whoever first spoke of minimal constitutive elements, hear of atoms? This notion had its origin in archetypal ideas, that is, in primordial images which were never reflections of physical events but are spontaneous products of the psychic factor. Despite the materialistic tendency to understand the psyche as a mere reflection or imprint of physical and chemical processes, there is not a single proof of this hypothesis. Quite the contrary, innumerable facts prove that the psyche translates physical processes into sequences of images which have hardly any recognizable connection with the objective process. The materialistic hypothesis is much too bold and flies in the face of experience with almost metaphysical presumption. The only thing that can be established with certainty, in the present state of our knowledge, is our ignorance of the nature of the psyche. There is thus no ground at all for regarding the psyche as something secondary or as an epiphenomenon. On the contrary, there is every reason to regard it, at least hypothetically, as a factor sui generis, and to go on doing so until it has been sufficiently proved that psychic processes can be fabricated in a retort. We have laughed at the claims of the alchemist. Constituted in itself, and always shall be, since we are obliged to convert physical events into psychic processes as soon as we want to say anything about knowledge. But who can guarantee that this conversion produces anything like an adequate objective picture of the world? That could only be if the physical event were also a psychic one. But a great distance still seems to separate us from such an assertion. On the concept of the archetype. 148 The concept of the Great Mother belongs to the field of comparative religion and embraces widely varying types of Mother Goddess. The concept itself is of no immediate concern to psychology, because the image of a Great Mother in this form is rarely encountered in practice, and then only under very special conditions. The symbol is obviously a derivative of the Mother archetype. If we venture to investigate the background of the Great Mother image from the standpoint of psychology, then the Mother archetype, as the more inclusive of the two, must form the basis of our discussion. Though lengthy discussion of the concept of an archetype is hardly necessary at this stage, some preliminary remarks of a general nature may not be out of place. 149 In former times, despite some dissenting opinion and the influence of Aristotle, it was not too difficult to understand Plato's conception of the idea as supraordinate and pre-existent to all phenomena. Archetype, far from being a modern term, was already in use before the time of St. Augustine, and was synonymous with idea in the Platonic usage. When the Corpus Hermeticum, which probably dates from the 3rd century, describes God as Tau A with grave rho O Phi, the archetypal light, it expresses the idea that he is the prototype of all light, that is to say, pre-existent and supraordinate to the phenomenon light. Were I a philosopher, I should continue in this Platonic strain and say, somewhere, in a place beyond the skies, there is a prototype or primordial image of the Mother that is pre-existent and supraordinate to all phenomena in which the maternal, in the broadest sense of the term, is manifest. But I am an empiricist, not a philosopher. I cannot let myself presuppose that my peculiar temperament, my own attitude to intellectual problems, is universally valid. Apparently this is an assumption in which only the philosopher may indulge, who always takes it for granted that his own disposition and attitude are universal, and will not recognize the fact, if he can avoid it, that his personal equation conditions his philosophy. As an empiricist, I must point out that there is a temperament which regards ideas as real entities and not merely as noumena. It so happens, by the merest accident, one might say, that for the past 200 years we have been living in an age in which it has become unpopular or even unintelligible to suppose that ideas could be anything but noumena. Anyone who continues to think as Plato did must pay for his anachronism by seeing the supercelestial, i.e., metaphysical, essence of the idea relegated to the unverifiable realm of faith and superstition, or charitably left to the poet. Once again, in the age-old controversy over universals, the nominalistic standpoint has triumphed over the realistic, and the idea has evaporated into a mere flatus vocis. This change was accompanied, and, indeed, to a considerable degree caused, by the marked rise of empiricism, the advantages of which were only too obvious to the intellect. Since that time the idea is no longer something a priori, but is secondary and derived. Naturally, the new nominalism promptly claimed universal validity for itself in spite of the fact that it, too, is based on a definite and limited thesis colored by temperament. This thesis runs as follows: we accept as valid anything that comes from outside and can be verified. The ideal instance is verification by experiment. The antithesis is, we accept as valid anything that comes from inside and cannot be verified. The hopelessness of this position is obvious. Greek natural philosophy with its interest in matter, together with Aristotelian reasoning, has achieved a belated but overwhelming victory over Plato. 150 Yet every victory contains the germ of future defeat. In our own day signs foreshadowing a change of attitude are rapidly increasing. Significantly enough, it is Kant's doctrine of categories, more than anything else, that destroys in embryo every attempt to revive metaphysics in the old sense of the word, but at the same time paves the way for a rebirth of the Platonic spirit. If it be true that there can be no metaphysics transcending human reason, it is no less true that there can be no empirical knowledge that is not already caught and limited by the a priori structure of cognition. During the century and a half that have elapsed since the appearance of the Critique of Pure Reason, the conviction has gradually gained ground that thinking, understanding, and reasoning cannot be regarded as independent processes subject only to the eternal laws of logic, but that they are psychic functions coordinated with the personality and subordinate to it. We no longer ask, has this or that been seen, heard, handled, weighed, counted, thought, and found to be logical? We ask instead, who saw, heard, or thought? Beginning with the personal equation in the observation and measurement of minimal processes, this critical attitude has gone on to the creation of an empirical psychology such as no time before ours has known. Today we are convinced that in all fields of knowledge psychological premises exist which exert a decisive influence upon the choice of material, the method of investigation, the nature of the conclusions, and the formulation of hypotheses and theories. We have even come to believe that Kant's personality was a decisive conditioning factor of his Critique of Pure Reason. Not only our philosophers, but our own predilections in philosophy, and even what we are fond of calling our best truths are affected, if not dangerously undermined, by this recognition of a personal premise. All creative freedom, we cry out, is taken away from us. What? Can it be possible that a man only thinks or says or does what he himself is? 151 Provided that we do not again exaggerate and so fall a victim to unrestrained psychologizing, it seems to me that the critical standpoint here defined is inescapable. It constitutes the essence, origin, and method of modern psychology. There is an a priori factor in all human activities, namely the inborn, preconscious, and unconscious individual structure of the psyche. The preconscious psyche, for example, that of a newborn infant, is not an empty vessel into which, under favorable conditions, practically anything can be poured. On the contrary, it is a tremendously complicated, sharply defined individual entity which appears indeterminate to us only because we cannot see it directly. But the moment the first visible manifestations of psychic life begin to appear, one would have to be blind not to recognize their individual character, that is, the unique personality behind them. It is hardly possible to suppose that all these details come into being only at the moment in which they appear. When it is a case of morbid predispositions already present in the parents, we infer hereditary transmission through the germplasm. It would not occur to us to regard epilepsy in the child of an epileptic mother as an unaccountable mutation. Again, we explain by heredity the gifts and talents which can be traced back through whole generations. We explain in the same way the reappearance of complicated instinctive actions in animals that have never set eyes on their parents and therefore could not possibly have been taught by them. 152 Nowadays we have to start with the hypothesis that, so far as predisposition is concerned, there is no essential difference between man and all other creatures. Like every animal, he possesses a preformed psyche which breeds true to his species and which, on closer examination, reveals distinct features traceable to family antecedents. We have not the slightest reason to suppose that there are certain human activities or functions that could be exempted from this rule. We are unable to form any idea of what those dispositions or aptitudes are which make instinctive actions in animals possible. And it is just as impossible for us to know the nature of the preconscious psychic disposition that enables a child to react in a human manner. We can only suppose that his behavior results from patterns of functioning, which I have described as images. The term image is intended to express not only the form of the activity taking place, but the typical situation in which the activity is released. These images are primordial images insofar as they are peculiar to whole species, and if they ever originated, their origin must have coincided at least with the beginning of the species. They are the human quality of the human being, the specifically human form his activities take. This specific form is hereditary and is already present in the germplasm. The idea that it is not inherited but comes into being in every child anew would be just as preposterous as the primitive belief that the sun which rises in the morning is a different sun from that which set the evening.
心拿回人生的主导权。什么是情绪？我们可以将情绪视为一系列个人主观经验，其中主观经验包括了个人的感受、思想与行为，也是一种心理和生理状态的综合体。换句话说，我们可以从3个面向来觉察情绪的存在。首先，你可以从心跳加速、手心冒汗、胸口郁闷等心理和生理反应来感受到自己的情绪，或者你可以从脑中忽然闪过的一些想法来发现自己的情绪。再不然，你也可以从自己所做的某些事情，也就是行为，来体验到自己的情绪。情绪是自己可以控制的吗？对大部分人来说，常常觉得情绪的出现是突然的、没有逻辑的，甚至会在一种令人毫无防备的状况下进入我们的生活。比方说，我的朋友小七在脸书上看见他小学同学的全家福照片，明明人家只是分享一下生活近照，根本没多说什么，但小七的心情却变得非常低落，手指一动就把他小学同学在网络上给封锁了，而他们原来还挺要好的。我们先停在这里想一想，你觉得小七的内心世界发生了什么，让他出现如此突然袭来的举动呢？是的，或许你已经想到，这是因为当小七看到同学在脸书线上闪现出来的幸福时，无意识地就连接到自己的不够幸福。虽然他和小学同学表面上并不是一种竞争关系，但他心理上却不由自主地浮现出两人正在互相竞争的意象。这种无意识的意象点燃了小七内心的负面情绪，让他陷入一种沮丧的、觉得自己事事不如人的状态当中。所以说，如果我们总是从意识的层面去想象情绪，你会觉得情绪这个东西似乎是人很难自我控制的。但如果我们是从无意识的概念去深入情绪的背后的脉络，你却会发现，那些引发我们负面情绪的事件，常常具有某些共通的本质。也就是说，只要能够早一步掌握情绪脉络背后的本质，我们就比较容易在事件发生的当下，觉察到自己真正在意的点是什么。用个心理学的概念来说，当我们愿意去面对心理的负面情绪时，很快你会发现那些负向情绪的背后，其实连接着我们内心世界的一处阴影。其实，如果我们可以不被困在那种不舒服的感觉中，而能更勇敢地再往里头踏进去一步时，很快你也会发现那些阴影背后，原来暗藏着许多我们还不够了解自己的地方。发现情绪阴影背后的自己有什么好处吗？当然，用炼金术来比喻这个历程，就像古代的炼金术士将一些看起来毫不起眼的物质，经过重重的提炼和锻炼，从中萃取出黄金等贵重金属一样。或许我们生而为人的意义，就是不断地从自己内在去内炼金，把负面情绪的阴影里头那些污浊不堪的感受、想法和行为，一次次地提取到我们的意识层面，透过接近、觉察、理解、接纳，将它们转化成我们身上独特而珍贵的特质。 当阴影提炼出来，见了光，就变成一种对生命有价值的滋养。我们不用再困进那些自我责备和讨厌别人的心灵牢狱当中，而能用一种更有弹性的立场去拥抱各种不同的经验与事件所要带给我们的生命的意义。要如何转化自己内在的情绪阴影，变成正向的力量？首先要了解这些阴影是用什么样的样貌出现在我们的情绪和生活当中。知道了情绪阴影的样貌之后，才能进一步去掌握它。而当我们真正掌握了心理的情绪阴影，也才能去了解为何自己始终无法摆脱别人对我们情感上的勒索，为何我们有时会困在对别人所说的话、所做的事情在意当中，无法共谈，为何我们明明排斥某些人事物，却不由自主要陷进里头去。为了描述情绪阴影的样貌，我借用荣格心理学中的原型 archetype 概念。所以所谓的原型，最初可追溯到柏拉图所提出的理型 forms， 意指所有真实世界的事物都可以对应到一个相似的典型。以美为例，对个人来说，美可能代表着美丽的花、美丽的房子、美丽的人，但美所对应的本质却是一样的。荣格相信，宇宙万物和不同个体之间存在着一个相似的法则、通则，但在每个人身上以独特的方式展现。因此，人们的成长会经历一些既定的序列，这些既定序列和共同性的呈现，就是原型。如同先前提过的，当我们仔细梳理负面情绪背后的脉络，会发现你、我、他之间存在着某些共同性，并且在我这个人身上有一些可依循的相似原则。比方说，遇见做事情啰里啰嗦的人，即使是不同对象，都会令我感到不耐烦。所以每遇到这种特质的人，我的口气就会变差。因此，从啰里啰嗦到口气变差，就是一个在我身上值得去探究的心灵序列。然而，对于听啰里啰嗦的人感到不耐烦这点，可能又同时存在于我和老王及老李的身上。可见我和我王和老李的内心世界都有或许有某些值得一起讨论的共同本质。当然，上述的例子都和情绪阴影有关。我从2014年到台北艺术大学任教后，便认识了美国心理学家卡洛琳·史密斯。卡洛琳·密斯借用荣格心理学的原型概念所设计出来的原型卡，其中以74个人物来描述存在于我们身上的不同特质。这些年来，我尝试将卡洛琳设计的原型卡融合到我所开设的心理觉察与书写课程中，透过人物原型的意向讨论，触发学生自由联想与书写，并且从书写的过程中发现这些原型人物与他们内在负面情绪的关联。经过过着学期的课程改良，累积了数百名大学生和社区成年人对于原型人物的书写资料，加上我在临床工作上的案例收集以及心理分析领域同才伙伴的协助，我将卡洛琳所描绘的人物原型形象浓缩删减，再与情绪阴影的概念相结合，以符合华人文化的叙述方式修正或重新命名，最后整理出来的成果都被我写进《情绪与阴影》这本书中。从《情绪与阴影》这本书中可以学到什么？情绪阴影是一本协助读者自我 分析的心理工具书，里头包含几个部分，以原型人物来描述我们内在情绪阴影的样貌与特质，以咨商式的缩写细角来觉察存在于内心世界的情绪阴影。另外，读者也可以运用原型56心理互动卡、原型卡的情境互动游戏来解决情绪阴影为我们生活所带来的困扰。因此，在阅读的过程中，建议读者可以着重在下列几个部分：一、辨识出那些影响你深远的原型人物形象，以及这些原型意象在你个人生命经验的连结。二、随着书中引导练习自由联想、自我对话与书写，反复理解那些特别容易触发你情绪的原型意象。三、透过各种生活情境的讨论，整理那些对你而言特别容易展现于外的强势原型，以及容易压力在内心的阴影原型。重新选择出有能力陪伴你调节情绪、自在过生活的原型组合。是的，在这本书中，我们就是要进行一场扎实的自我分析与觉察之旅，从情绪阴影着手，为自我炼金，祝福我们每个人都能成为更自由的我，更喜欢自己的我，以及更快乐的我。只有不理解黑暗的人才会恐惧夜晚。透过理解你内在的黑暗与神秘，你会变得简单纯粹。引自荣格的红书。 竟然是2宫，导入运行的，是